Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah,
You're here because you want to get straight to what matters, quickly, without all the noise.
exactly. And today we're tackling the Dutch Spring Memorandum, the Voorjaarsnota. It's certainly been causing a stir.
It really has. So we're going to break it down for you. We've got the details from Prime Minister Scoot's press conference, plus questions from all the major news outlets and AD, RTL, you name it.
Our goal here is really to, pull out the key decisions, the debates, the sticking points, and what this all means for the country's direction financially and policy-wise.
Let's dive in. Scoof called the negotiations a marathon. He used phrases like headwind, high temperatures, even fear of hitting the wall.
Yeah, quite dramatic language. But he did end by calling the result satisfying, though, with sweet and sour parts. That itself tells you a lot.
It does. It signals compromise, right?
Hmm.
Not a clear win for any single agenda. So what were the sweet parts he highlighted?
Well, the big investments. First, what he called existing security things like stopping rent hikes in social housing, making energy and childcare more affordable.
Okay, things people feel day to day. What else?
Then there's defense, community resilience, infrastructure, and also the agricultural sector. Pretty wide-ranging.
Where did the money for all that come from? I heard something about unexpected gains.
That's right. He mentioned meavelers, basically windfalls or positive budget balances helped fund some of this.
Okay, so that's the sweet. What about the sour bits?
Well, the income tax reduction is smaller than they originally planned.
So maybe less relief there than some hoped for?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also a general curb on government spending growth. They're holding back on fully adjusting for wage and price increases.
Tightening the belt elsewhere then. What does that signal to you?
It suggests, a cautious approach, trying to balance the new spending with some fiscal restraint, maybe looking ahead at economic uncertainty.
But Scoof insisted the overall picture is balanced. All expenses covered.
Yes, that was his key message on the finances. And he confirmed the cabinet approved sending the draft memorandum to the CPB, that's the Economic Analysis Bureau, and the Council of State for review.
Important checks and balances there. The CPB analysis is always crucial.
Absolutely. And the Council of State looks at the legality, the feasibility. Standard procedure, but necessary before it all goes public.
But okay, the press immediately jumped on whether this marathon actually finished. They pointed to big things seemingly left unresolved.
Right. Like climate policy details, the whole nitrogen issue, even clarity on future NATO defense spending targets.
So was the implication that they just stopped halfway? Kick the can down the road?
That was certainly the angle of some questions. It raises the point. What is this memorandum really finalizing versus what's still, up in the air?
How did Scoof respond to that?
Pretty pragmatically, actually. He basically said you can't put money in the budget for plans that aren't fully baked yet.
Makes sense, I suppose.
He mentioned work is ongoing for nitrogen. And for defense spending, they need decisions from the upcoming NATO summit first. So this memorandum, he argued, is focused on adjusting the budgets for 25 and 26 based on current progress.
Right, so it's more of an update based on where things stand now, not the final word on everything.
Precisely. But that didn't stop the opposition from saying the government is afraid to govern or just delaying tough decisions.
A predictable political attack, maybe?
Sure. And Scoof's counter was, look, we govern daily, and getting this document done proves we can finalize things. It's that classic clash of narratives you always see.
Okay, another point of friction seemed to be transparency. Why did it feel like only the sweet parts, the good news, got highlighted publicly before the whole thing was released?
Yeah, that question came up. Scoof's answer was interesting. He said the communication strategy, what got emphasized early on was decided by the parliamentary leaders of the coalition parties.
Not the cabinet itself.
That's what he stated. He maintained that he, in the press conference, gave a balanced picture, the sweet and the sour. It really points to the power dynamics in a coalition.
But didn't he complain about leaks from the cabinet before? How does that square?
He drew distinction. He said parliamentary leaders talking about agreed-upon outcomes is one thing, but ministers leaking internal deliberations while decisions are still being made? That's different, and that's what he objected to previously.
Okay, a fine line, perhaps, but a distinction nonetheless. What about the timing? The cabinet only finalized it on the morning of the press conference.
Yes, that very morning. which understandably led to questions about how much input ministers really had on the final details affecting their own budgets.
Right. Did it feel like the parliamentary leaders cooked it up and the ministers just had to sign off?
That was the concern raised. Scoof pushed back, saying ministers were generally aware of the main points, maybe not every single detail until the final text, but aware. And he stressed the cabinet did formally endorse it via a digital vote.
So collective responsibility kicked in, even if some weren't thrilled.
That seems to be the implication. He acknowledged they might not have had the complete integrated overview until the last minute, but the agreement was reached collectively in the end.
And Scoof's own role. As a non-party prime minister, how involved was he in the nitty-gritty negotiations?
He described a multi-stage process. The finance minister led talks with individual ministries first. Then the cabinet presented a package to the parliamentary leaders. Then came the political talks.
So where did he fit in?
He said he oversaw the whole thing, stayed informed, and participated at key moments, including that final all-nighter. He wasn't in every room, but he framed himself as guiding the process. He did admit it got very complicated.
I bet. So he wasn't just a bystander. But still, some critics called the outcome a hussar trick or a makeshift solution. Not exactly glowing reviews.
No. Scoof rejected that makeshift label. He called it balanced. While admitting, future events will require more adjustments, he defended it as a solid agreement for now.
Despite that, there were these reports. Ministers saying they didn't know much about budget changes before walking into that final cabinet meeting.
Yeah, those reports persisted. Scoot's response was a bit nuanced. He suggested ministers knew the main thrust for their areas, and the cabinet did agree. He even hinted one vice premier wasn't exactly jumping for joy, but still agreed.
Reads between the lines a bit there.
It does suggest maybe some reservations or surprise at the specifics, even with overall agreement.
And why the delay in releasing the actual documents after the cabinet meeting? If it was agreed, why not just publish it?
His explanation was basically due diligence. It's a massive document. Tons of figures, appendices. They needed final checks to ensure everything added up correctly. Literally, accuracy was paramount.
Okay, makes sense. Avoid errors. He also really pushed back against the idea that the cabinet was just a stamp machine for the party leaders.
Right. He kept emphasizing the whole process: finance minister talks, ministry input, then political consultation, then cabinet approval, trying to show it wasn't just top-down from the party leaders.
But the surprise factor among ministers still lingered in the questions.
It did. Scoof sort of deflected slightly, suggesting maybe surprise isn't the same as disagreement, while insisting they were broadly informed. Careful wording again.
Let's talk about that political consultation with the parliamentary leaders. How much power did they really have over the final budgets?
Scoof justified it by saying political agreement from the four coalition parties was simply essential for decisions in certain areas. You need the backing of the parties in parliament.
So that's where the core political deals were struck, potentially overriding earlier ministerial plans.
That seems to be where the crucial compromises happened, yes, which inevitably impacts the final budget allocations for ministers.
There was even that story about the Minister of Social Affairs waving their portfolio around in frustration during those talks.
Yes. Scoof didn't deny it happened, though he clarified it was during talks with the relevant parliamentary leader, not with him directly. But he did stress that the minister did ultimately agree in the cabinet meeting.
Gives you a sense of the tension, though.
Absolutely. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though Scoof did contrast it with financial talks back in August, saying while this took longer, there weren't the same enormous outbursts, maybe hinting his presence helped keep things calmer.
Interesting point. Okay, let's shift to some specifics. Nitrogen policy, about 600 million euros allocated for 2025 and 2026.
Yes, and that's on top of the 5.5 billion already set aside for the agricultural sector transition.
But is it enough? Isn't there an expectation that much more will be needed long-term?
Definitely. Everyone expects more funding will be required to meet the legal requirements. Scoof acknowledged this, saying the aim is to finalize the actual plans before summer, focusing on thoroughness.
So fund the next couple of years for now, make concrete plans, and then figure out the longer-term budget later.
Exactly. He said the current money allows for a real start over the next 2 years. The bigger budget implications come later once the plans are solid. Similar, he said, to how they'll approach long-term defense spending based on NATO decisions.
A phased approach, then. What about Bestandssicherheit, security of existence, things like capping social rents, making energy cheaper? Is that just income redistribution, nivellering, by another name.
Ah, the classic debate. Scoof framed it as helping those facing hardship, not explicit nivellering as a policy goal. But
It does redistribute income, doesn't it?
he acknowledged that, yes, it's a consequence. He gave the example of someone in social housing getting help versus someone renting privately with a job. The impacts differ, leading to redistribution. So goal versus effect.
Got it. What about businesses? Was there much new support for them in this memorandum?
Not really specific new plans announced here. Scoof pointed to ongoing policies and said plans are coming from the ministers for climate and economy, focusing on the business, climate, and jobs. So maybe more to come, but not in this specific package.
Okay. And net congestion, the overloaded electricity grid, a huge issue. But apparently climate measures got pushed to August. Anything concrete here?
Not major new initiatives in this document, no. Scoof mentioned ongoing work and recent decisions. He did highlight the new state guarantees for Tenet, the grid operator.
What do those guarantees do?
They allow Tenet to borrow money more cheaply for grid investments backed by the state, but without it directly hitting the national debt or changing Tenet's independent status. So it's a way to facilitate investment.
Right, a financial mechanism. What about the overall deficit and debt figures? Did they change?
Scoof wouldn't give the exact numbers before the official release, standard practice, but he did confirm they remain within the EU norms.
So fiscally responsible is the message.
That's the signal, yes, staying within the European rules.
That rent freeze for social housing costing over $1 billion a year. How are they compensating housing corporations? And is it permanent?
It's explicitly temporary compensation. The aim is to ensure the building target 100,000 homes a year doesn't get derailed. The Minister of Housing had raised concerns about that.
And after the temporary freeze ends,
That wasn't clarified. So some uncertainty remains about future rent adjustments for tenants.
okay. The income tax cut being smaller. How did Scoof justify that, especially with healthcare premiums rising?
He argued that even with the smaller cut, lower income groups still come out ahead, enough to cover higher premiums and allow for having the own risk, Eigenrisiko, in healthcare.
Even though the original bigger tax cut was meant specifically to offset those premiums.
Right. His point was that the overall package, including the own risk change or other measures, still achieves that compensation goal, just through a slightly different mix.
And the boot shopping bonus, the shopping bonus, is it literally for groceries?
No, he clarified it's not a voucher or restricted spending. It's just a general measure to give people more disposable income, more financial breathing room. They decide how to spend it.
He didn't even know where the name came from.
Apparently not. Or at least he claimed uncertainty. A small, amusing detail.
Did getting this deal done boost his own political position, do you think?
He downplayed any personal aspect, naturally, focused on the importance for government stability and the country's finances. But, getting it done certainly counters those predictions that the government might fall over this.
Yeah, lots of people were saying this could be the thing that broke the coalition.
Exactly. So reaching an agreement, however difficult, sends a message of, well, functionality, at least for now.
Did he feel he'd taken the stronger steering role he'd talked about wanting earlier?
He seemed satisfied with the collaboration between himself and the finance minister, saying they managed the process effectively together, from the initial ministry talks right through the political negotiations.
Even though some reporting made it sound like it was mostly the finance minister and the party leaders hashing it out.
He maintained his involvement, regular consultations, being present at key meetings, including late nights, and ultimately the cabinet decision. He presented it as a team effort he was overseeing.
And just to clarify, Peter Omsic wasn't part of these specific talks between the cabinet and the 4 coalition parties.
Correct. Scoof confirmed Omsic was not directly involved in that particular negotiation phase.
Okay, what about inflation? It's still high in the Netherlands compared to elsewhere. Did this memorandum do anything specific to fight it beyond that shopping bonus?
Not direct inflation-fighting measures, no. Scoof pointed to the Dutch central bank expecting a gradual decline and stressed, national governments have limited tools against global inflation drivers.
So the focus is more on cushioning the blow for people.
Exactly. Supporting those struggling with the cost of living rather than macroeconomic inflation control. He couldn't really predict when people would feel significant relief given the global instability.
And the Tata Steel layoffs.
Yeah.
A big shock. Any connection to broader industrial policy in the memorandum?
No specific new funding like Germany has done, for instance. Scoof spoke about ongoing talks with energy-intensive industries about the investment climate and jobs involving several ministers. But concrete financial aid wasn't part of this package. Maybe later, he suggested.
Right. Finally, his upcoming trip to Japan. What's the significance there?
He's meeting Prime Minister Kishida, opening the Dutch pavilion at the World Expo in Osaka. He emphasized the strong ties, especially on security, which is obviously relevant now.
Was it planned because of the current climate?
No, he said it was planned earlier, linked to the expo. But the security dimension is certainly timely, especially with NATO's route also having visited Japan recently.
And defense spending came up again regarding NATO targets.
Yes. He confirmed the Netherlands is on track for the 2% target, and this memorandum adds more defense funding for 2026. Decisions on future spending, possibly higher targets, will come after the NATO summit in June.
What about that French coalition of the willing idea for Ukraine?
He said the Netherlands is actively involved in the planning, thinking it through, but hasn't made a firm commitment to join yet. He also pushed back strongly on any idea that the Netherlands' current spending level means it has less say in these talks.
Okay, so quite a lot packed into that press conference.
Absolutely. So summing up this deep dive, we've seen a spring memorandum born from pretty intense negotiations, a real balancing act.
Investments in Social Security, defense, agriculture, but also spending caps and that smaller income tax cut.
And key issues like nitrogen, long-term climate plans, future defense budgets still needing more detailed plans and funding decisions down the line.
Plus, those ongoing questions about transparency, the power balance between cabinet and party leaders.
Yeah.
Lots of dynamics at play.
For sure. The full documents, when released, will obviously provide much more detail for anyone wanting to dig deeper.
Which leads us with a final thought for you, the listener. Given all these tensions, the compromises, the unfinished business we've talked about, what does this whole process around the spring memorandum really signal about the current state and maybe the future direction of Dutch governance and policy making?
Yeah, that's definitely something worth mulling over.